day when I was a little girl, I was getting into the family van and I accidentally slammed the door shut on my sister's hand. She let out this awful scream and I realized what I had done. But instead of comforting her and apologizing, I denied that I had done it at all. I protested, "I didn't do it, I was nowhere near the door. She did it to herself." As she was crying and crying, I continued denying and defended myself at her expense. And that hurt her heart more than the door had hurt her hand. Why did I treat my sister this way? I wasn't a mean kid, but I was a very defensive kid. It came from growing up in a violent household where making mistakes was often followed by a beating. So I loved my brothers and sisters, but I sometimes threw them under the bus so that I would stay out of trouble. I didn't like this about myself, and as I grew older, I decided to change it, and I ended up studying conflict resolution. I wanted to figure out what causes conflict, especially violent conflict, and what can we do to prevent it. I learned, unsurprisingly, that one of the most important things we can do is to practice non-defensiveness. And the reason for that is that being defensive tends to invite the same response in other people. So it makes conflict worse. Now, I'm proud to stand here today and tell you that I've gotten better. These days, when someone is upset with me, I can say, "Tell me more about why you're frustrated," instead of, "Hold on, are you going to blame me for that?" But I still wondered, how could non-defensiveness work when it came to groups of people, when it came to larger communities where groups of people were frustrated with each other? Could non-defensiveness prevent violent conflict? The answer to that is yes. I've spent much of my professional life in communities around the world studying how people prevent violence through a non-defensive way of being. And one of the most important places I've ever visited that taught me this lesson was Baghdad, Iraq. Iraq is home to two major sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia. And for most of history, these two communities have lived in relative peace. But when the United States invaded in 2003, it really upset the relationship between these two communities. And two armed groups emerged, Al-Qaeda in the Sunni camp and the Mahdi army in the Shia camp. And both militias said that they were defending each community from the other. And they fought each other in a brutal sectarian civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, before the US invaded Baghdad, most of the people in Baghdad lived in mixed communities represented by the orange color on the map. So you had Sunni and Shia and Christian residents living side by side. But the militias started to attack people living in those neighborhoods. And by 2007, enough people had been forced out of their homes that the city became divided into Sunni and Shia enclaves represented by the red and green colors. Let me show you that one more time. This historic ancient city used to be almost entirely mixed, became almost entirely divided in a few short years. Most of the people that we talked to did not want to take sides at first, but the militias started spreading fear-provoking messages like this one. They encouraged people to fear each other. They convinced people that they needed the militia's protection. What I went to Baghdad to study, to learn more about, were communities where this did not happen, where people could not be persuaded to take up arms against each other. I call these resilient communities, because they were resilient to the militia's scaremongering. When we would ask people, how is this possible? How were you able to prevent the spread of fear in your neighborhood surrounded by so much death and torture and destruction? They would say things like this: We have a culture of peace. The relationships are strong. We've known each other for a long time. Essentially, these are local narratives, which are collections of stories that are related to each other, about people, relationships, and events. And what they do is that they frame how we understand the past, they frame what we think is possible for the future, and they guide our behavior in the present moment. So essentially in Baghdad, you had these two sets of narratives: a defensive narrative, which caused conflict, whose core elements was fear, hatred, and victimhood, and you had a non-defensive, or as I like to call it, an inclusive narrative, whose core elements were the opposite. Instead of fear, support. Instead of hatred, compassion, and courage instead of victimhood. And in the neighborhoods with the inclusive narratives, people stuck up for each other. They stuck together like glue, and nothing could move them from that position. Now, inclusive narratives are not unique to Baghdad. If you listen for them, you can hear them in resilient communities all around the world. In fact, I heard them in my own city of San Diego when I listened to local news reports about a little neighborhood in southeast San Diego that used to be known as Dodge City. It was known colloquially as Dodge City because of the drug houses in the neighborhood, and it was kind of a sketchy place to live. It didn't feel safe for the people who lived there. One day, somebody new moved to the neighborhood, Robert Robinson, and he became disturbed by what he saw. He saw that neighbors didn't know each other that well. He saw that there was some racial tension between the predominantly Black and Hispanic and a few white neighbors who lived with each other. And he could tell that Dodge City was surrounded on almost all sides by active and rival gang territories. So Robinson started talking with a few other residents about ways to make the neighborhood better. They decided to look back at the area's past, and they found some old maps, and they discovered that their subdivision had been built in the 1960s under the name Broadway Heights. Armed with this new name, they decided to build a new narrative for their community that centered, in their words, on engagement. And they began very simply by inviting residents to a community meeting and a potluck at Robinson's house. And over time, as more and more residents came, more and more people got on board with this new narrative of inclusion and empowerment and support. And they made big changes in the neighborhood. They formed a formal community council. They negotiated with the city of San Diego for new streetlights. They introduced drug education into the neighborhood. They closed down those drug houses. They got youth scholarships. And now, Broadway Heights, although it could not change its location amongst those different gang territories, has one of the lowest homicide rates in all of San Diego. And their kids join the local youth council instead of the nearby gangs. So what I have learned from resilient communities, from Baghdad to Iraq, is that the stories that we tell ourselves have tremendous power. What's important is to be conscious about what they are. When I was an adult, determined to become less defensive, I had to ask myself, who and what are you defending yourself from? Your father can't hurt you anymore. You're not that child anymore. Asking those questions allowed me to open myself up to the people around me. And doing that made me a better sister, friend, and human being. So I suppose my challenge for all of us is this. We all face challenges in our lives, but we can actively choose to introduce internal narratives for ourselves that are non-defensive and resilience-promoting. Because after all, you are the narrator of your own life, and only you can decide what is the next chapter in the story of your life. Thank you.